So we are in conversation regarding the rights of nature with Felwine Sarr and Brigitte Stepanov. Felwine Sarr is the Anne Marie Bryan Chair in French and Francophone Studies at Duke University. He is also the author of Afrotopia and serves as editor of the Journal of African Transformation and co-founder of Ateliers de la Pensée. In 2021, Sarr was listed as one of Time's 100 most influential people. Let's welcome Felwine. Dr. Brigitte Stepanov writes and teaches about how categories of being, knowledge, and aesthetic forms are stretched and blurred by violence. In her current book project, Cruelty, War, Fiction, Redefining the Inhuman, she dissects the very category of violence in Algeria, Rwanda, and France, as defined by legal and literary frames. She is currently an assistant professor at Georgia Tech. Let's welcome Dr. Brigitte.
Can you all hear me? Yes? Volume is okay? All right. Thank you so much for having us. All right. Okay. So thank you so much for having us. Looking forward to this discussion. 3 movements with which to begin tonight. First, an acknowledgement that we are on the traditional homelands of the Muskogee Creek and Cherokee peoples who were displaced through violence and governmental policies in the 1830s to make room for European settlers. Second, a recognition of the recent devastation of lives and ecosystems lost in East Palestine, in Turkey, and in Syria. And third, a provocation, a question that resonates between our work. Does plant life have a right to rights? This is the question at the heart of the rights of nature, a juridical turn that enables nature, rivers, mountains, forests, ecosystems, the legal right to exist, thrive, and regenerate. In other words, the legal rights to be protected against destruction by deliberate or negligent human action. And so to begin, Felwine, does plant life have a right to rights?
So thank you, Brigitte. I would like to start by saying that I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank David for the invitation. So the question of the right of the nature is a very critical question because there's an important movement these last 20 years who tried to give rights to plants, animal, ecosystem, and mountain in order to help, to allow them to defend themselves against all the threat, the ecocide that they are experiencing given the, I would say, the neoliberal economy and extractivist capitalism that we are experiencing. And the question was, on which basis are we able to give rights to non-human? So it was a very difficult question on a, I would say, on a philosophical point of view, who is entitled to talk on the behalf of nature, in bracket. If they experience threat or damage, are we able to compensate it? And if we have to compensate it, who will be the one who represents them? In 2008, in Ecuador, they give in their constitution the right to what they call the Pachamama, Mother Earth, with this idea that ecosystem has the right to live, to regenerate its own cycle, to protect itself, and people can be designed as legal representatives of this ecosystem and respond or sue or introduce a lawsuit on their behalf. And following Ecuador, so we have Bolivia in 2020, New Zealand in 2017, even in the US here in Ohio. And I think the first idea of giving rights to nature came from a US lawyer in 1972 named Christopher Stone in California, who thought that at that time we were able to decide that animals, vegetables, or plants we can have rights. So the question is, if you give them rights, where are the boundaries of individuality to make them subject of law? The boundaries of an animal or a human person are more easy to draw than the boundaries of plants, because plants are system of relation more than individual entities. So there's a very interesting question to respond here. And secondly, these attempts to give them legal rights, is it useful or is it effective? Does it change really the story? It's a second question. A third question, if we don't use this kind of jurisdictional fiction, how do we protect them more efficiently? And are we the one who are entitled to protect the so-called nature? So probably there is here a kind of anthropocentrism. So we are projecting on the so-called nature our own categories, and is the question really here?
Absolutely. There's a growing list of cities and nation states that are putting these legal instruments into action. And I'd like to focus in on this idea of category a little bit more, and to kind of call into question, as you just said, the usefulness of this frame. And part of me worries that the rights of nature reveal schisms that exist between categories and further hollows out these divisions. I think there's a lot of violence inherent in taxonomy, a lot of hierarchies that exist there. And is the rights of nature a frame that can help us escape the violence of classification itself? Or does it fall prey to that same violence?
I think one of the questions you raise here is how we relate with the so-called non-human, and how we place ourselves in a kind of cosmology, and what is the place we give ourselves in that cosmology. The fact that we call this era Anthropocene means that the main geological force, there is an anthropic force that drive our current way of relating to the so-called nature, came from the action of the human being, and a growing corpus of thought and literature. I think that the question is an ontological question. Is that we are not able to see ourselves or to define our ontologies as relational ontologies. So we have a separate ontologies, and the question is here in the separation of nature and culture, human and plant, etc. But at the same time, we are very aware of our singularity as human, and the question is, how do we translate the fact that we are interdependent in the cycle of ecosystem and life into behaviors, into ways of relating? And I think that the languages, the taxonomies, and I would say the imaginaries of belonging are absolutely important here. And some thinkers thought that instead of giving rights to the nature, so being in the division we and the nature, the question is giving right to a system of relation. If you give right to a river or a forest, it's not just to say that the river is an individual to whom you give rights. It's the idea that the river is an ecosystem, is a set of relation in which plants, human, animals, non-human are in an interdependent cycle, and you give the rights to this ecosystem to live, to defend itself, to regenerate. So the human are in that cycle, so they are not outside of the cycle. So the question of the taxonomy is also a question of being able to shift the centrality of our position in the living, and to probably move towards an idea of the unity of the living more than the separateness of each entities. But it's a long way to do that, because all these categories are deeply rooted in our imaginaries, in our intellectual structure, in the way we portray ourselves, and in the way that we still think that we are the center of all this.
Absolutely. This idea of ontological conundrum, how to categorize beings, what rights do different categories have and hold. I wonder if there's also an epistemological valence. So, how do we categorize not only beings, but systems of knowledge? How do we know what we know, and how do we know that we know it, and why do we value it? Ashila Mbembe in Decolonizing Knowledge and the Question of the Archive states that at the end of the decolonizing process, we will no longer have a university. And he mentions the pluriversity, and I know that you're a proponent of pluriversalism, so thinking about epistemic diversity, right? Multiple ways of knowing and evaluating the production of knowledge, and that can be applied to the university, as I just mentioned, to the museum, as you've worked on extensively, to works that we deem canonical, right? What Mudimbe would call the colonial library. But I also think that it can be brought to the law, right? That we can bring epistemic diversity to earth jurisprudence, or jurisprudence generally. And so I wonder, if you could talk a little bit more about this epistemological valence when it comes to the rights of nature, and if you think that it's specifically through greater epistemic diversity that we can practice, earth and earthly democracy.
I think that one of the questions is that, as the Zapatist says there is a plurality of world in the world. So there's not just one reality. And the world is not a given object just in front of us that we try to apprehend through knowledge. The world is a project. We are in that project, and it's a dynamic that we are part of it. And a type of knowledge produces a type of subjectivity, and opens one type of gaze on the reality. And the other reality that are within the reality are not seen if we only rely on a type of epistemological framework. So the plurality of epistemologies, offer the possibility to be able to see the plurality of realities that are within the reality. And an epistemology is a way of seeing the world, but also affect subjectivities, and at the end of the day, affect behaviors and way of relating. So the idea is more to open the gaze, on the reality, and to rely on the plurality of archive, way of knowing, know-how, way of behaving. So the people who live in close intimacy with those ecosystems, they have knowledge that the classical scientific knowledge don't have. They know how to relate, so they have accumulated in the long run a rich experience of knowing, of knowledge, of non-scientific knowledge, and those knowledges are useful to be able to interact with those ecosystems. So I think that this question of plurality in ways of knowing, or what I would call ecologies of knowledge, or epistemic diversity, is not just I would say a way of criticizing the main epistemology. It's a way of saying that, okay, this epistemology is important, interesting, but it's not enough. We need much more insights to be able to decipher the complexity of reality, and those knowledges are useful to do that. Even though when we project to a category of non-human, our human languages. And when we talk on their behalf, we are not learning their own languages, because we could learn their own languages and let them represent themselves. But we are always thinking that the knowledge we had on them as objects is the one that is more relevant. And I'm not sure it's always the case. So there is also this idea of being able to learn from the non-human and to try to learn their own languages. If they have categories, I don't know, but their own way of expressing themselves, being in a relation, etc., etc. And all this is a question of opening the space of knowledges.
In line with this idea of opening up spaces of knowledges, do you think that we need to think on a different scale? Not just the rights of nature, the rights of the earth, not even the rights of Gaia, but the rights of the cosmos. If we're talking about exploitation, there's a lot of rhetoric around extracting resources from other planets as well, which I think ties into that. Do you think this is a way of kind of expanding in generative ways this frame?
I think that the question of the scale is important, but also the question of the durée is important. Most of the time, when we pretend that we have to defend nature, my feeling is that nature don't really need us to be defended. We are defending our biotop and our ecological environment that allow us to live, and we know that we are putting in the danger the condition of reproduction of life. It's why we are scared of that. But if the human species disappear, nature will take his time and will regenerate itself in the long durée. And probably, we will leave some traces, but the nature will find a way, to regenerate its own in the long durée. So the question for me is much more to rethink ontologically the place we occupy and how we have produced an imaginary of our centrality in that space, and how we are not able to live in, I would say, in good intelligence and harmony with all the beings, the human, the non-human, etc. And knowing that we are a part of a cycle, we are part of a cycle, we are part of an ecology, we are part of a system of relation, and we have to take the right place in that system. But here, I think the question is a question of civilization, culture, knowledge, cosmologies, and all these are space where we can slowly try to work to be able to change our imaginaries. And I think it's also a question of imaginaries. It's a question of knowledge, obviously, but it's a question of the way we portray ourselves and the way we represent ourselves as beings, in that ecology.
Right, in that system. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Our time is up. It goes by very rapidly in the midst of great conversation. But as we think through these ways of expanding our understanding of the law and who can be privy to its benefits, I invite you to ask questions. We have a few minutes, I think, for that, about 5 minutes. And there's a microphone too, if those would. But yes, Dre in the front. Yeah.
think that normally we assume that nature have the right to exist and defend its own existence and its own ability to regenerate itself, as we have the right to exist as human beings. And because that we are not respecting that right, and we are objectifying nature, and we have an instrumental reason that all the non-human are devoted to our end, we the human, that in the middle of this process, we just woke up saying, okay, we have to defend the right of the nature. But at the same time, it's an anthropocentric gesture that lies on the idea that we didn't, at the beginning of the process, consider nature as being, as us, because all our categories from the Bible to Descartes is that we are the masters and the possessor of nature, and we have to use it for our own finalities and end. I think one of the problems is there.
And I'll just add really quickly to say that if you look at these bills, so the bill of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, it says that it's upholding the rights of nature, but actually every single article is we, the people, want to protect nature because we have a right to clean air and we have a right to clean water, so on and so forth. But there's nothing there about actually protecting nature. It's protecting the humans that inhabit the ecosystem. So, that's also something that's a sticking point. There's all this terminology, but it's still very much anthropocentric. So, yeah.
Is it on? Okay, cool. So this is really interesting. It makes me think of climate change, makes me think of settler colonialism, gentrification even. And so my question is, how could giving nature rights explicitly, like you mentioned in Ohio, impact the aforementioned? Like, what would the world look like in that regard? And I think you kind of just touched on it a little bit, but any other thoughts to add?
No, I didn't understand the end of the question. How did?
Like, how would giving nature rights affect the aforementioned, like explicitly, in a way that you just mentioned, like having a cleaner air would be like something that could come as a result of that. So like anything else to add to that? Like, what could the world look like? What could the US look like?
I think in Latin America, so they have interesting example in Ecuador, where they give rights to the river and the ecosystem, and they prohibit, and in New Zealand also, so there is a river called the Whangarui River. They prohibit exploitation of the river from the companies, and the Maori people were designed to be the one who implement that. So the main outcome is the protection of the regeneration cycles, so they can regenerate themselves in their own temporalities in the long term without being hurt, and etc., etc. So I think we can become nuanced. So there are some examples where so I don't like the word nature, but I'm using it, but the so-called nature had the time to breathe, to regenerate itself outside of the impact of the human activities and outside of the impact of what we call Anthropocene. But we are not sure that in the long term it's the right way to do it. But in the short term, in some places, so it stops, the dynamics of extractivism. So it's right.
Thank you.
Can I do one more? This is a very exciting talk. I just was upstairs speaking about a project to connect Atlantans to their local creeks. Part of the motive of that project is to create litigation power for each of the local creeks in Atlanta. Currently, the American context, legal context, is corporate personhood, and we're trying to support personhood for creeks, rivers, mountains. How would that be different than how this is playing out in Ecuador, New Zealand, Bolivia, other examples? Thank you.
I think it's the same idea. It's deeply the same idea. The idea is to create a personhood for rivers, plant, tree, and the debate in the space of law is to have a personhood. You must be an individual, or you must be the one who is representing yourself. And I think the question here is how to shift from the idea of an individual to an idea of an ecosystem of relations. And I think law is a fiction, and probably we can become more creative and imagine a fiction where the rights are not given to individuals, but to set of relations, and to move from the individuality to the idea of relationality, and to give or to bear legal rights to relationalities that allow life and sustain life.
Thank you so much to you all. Let's keep
Thank you,
thinking
Brigitte.
within this ethos of relationality. Yeah.